Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com, and today I'm going to be taking a look at a hand that I recently played in a $3,500 buy-in World Poker Tour event. We started with 30,000 chips. I've chipped down to 21,000. It's not quite what you want to happen, but sometimes it does. I pick up 9-8 suited in middle position, so I'm certainly going to raise this. I make it 600 at 100, 200. This seems very standard to me. Then a satellite qualifier makes it 1,200. When you see someone who you think is probably a weaker player re-raise, or someone who is out of their comfort zone re-raise, they typically have a very strong hand. And also, when you see someone re-raise very small, especially if you think their standard raises are somewhat large, as most players will be, it's usually a very strong hand, like aces or kings or queens or maybe ace-king. So I'm going to call 600 more in this spot purely because of my implied odds. I think I can put in 600 more and then not really risk too many more chips unless I make a very strong hand. So I'm going to call 600 and try to make a hand that can beat aces. And then I'll look to put all the money in. So the flop comes queen, 8-7, two clubs. I check, and my opponent bets 1,500 into the 2,700 chip pot. When this happens, I don't really think this narrows my opponent's range much. I think most people are going to continuation bet in this scenario with ace-king as well as the big pairs, and also with pocket queens, and probably even pocket jacks. So if I think my opponent has a very tight range, which I do in this scenario, I am going to call, again though, sort of citing the implied odds. I have to put in 1,500 to potentially win an additional 17,300, which is a lot. 18,300, I can't count. 18,300, which is my 19,800 stack minus the 1,500, plus the amount that's in the pot. So our immediate pot odds are not great, but our implied odds, I think, are going to be pretty fantastic. And notice that any diamond is also reasonable for us. It's not like I'm only trying to improve to two pair or three of a kind. Also, a 10 is not so bad, and a 6 is not so bad. So we have a pretty good amount of cards on the turn that can improve us. So I do improve to one of the hands that I'm going to assume is the best hand most of the time in the scenario. I get the 9. And now I have to ask myself, what is the best way to go about getting money in this pot? Well, if my opponent has aces or kings or queens, well, aces or kings, he's going to be betting the turn pretty much every time. Same thing goes for ace-queen if he happens to have that. So I'm not really so concerned about getting money in versus the good hands. I actually am concerned that my opponent may have something like pocket queens, so I don't think I'm trying to play this hand for stacks. I mean, you have to recognize that if your opponent does have queens in this scenario, it's pretty unlucky. But I don't know if I can, for sure, count on my opponent betting the turn with pocket aces, then calling a check raise, and then calling a big river bet. So I don't know. This is a dicey spot. I could really see going either way when it comes to check calling or check raising if my opponent bets the turn. The other option is to just bet the turn. But the problem with betting the turn is if my opponent does have ace-king and he decides to bluff, or he wants to bluff if I check, I'm letting him off the hook by leading into him. He's just going to fold a lot of those hands. And also, I don't really get the opportunity to check raise on the turn or the river if my opponent happens to have a hand like aces or kings. He's just going to call the turn and then call the river. We're going to win a big pot, but that's probably how it's going to go down. So I think leading in this scenario would be perfectly fine against some players, but I have a hard time figuring out exactly how people are going to respond to sort of abnormal betting lines. And the betting line that this would have been is I would raise pre-flop, call a 3-bet, check call flop, and then lead on a relatively scary turn. And this is a somewhat scary turn. Queen 9 gets there, 9-8 gets there, 9-7 gets there. Maybe Jack 10 of clubs gets there, 6-5 gets there. So a lot of random hands get here on the turn. So a hand like pocket aces really does become a bluff catcher if you get led into. And I would rather my opponent just think his hand is the nuts. I think that makes it much easier for him to pile a stack in happily. So anyway, I check turn. Opponent checks behind. So when he checks behind on the turn, I think he probably has a hand like pocket jacks, pocket 10s, or ace-king. I think he would bet aces, kings, pocket queens, and ace-queen pretty much every time. So I am assuming my opponent does not have that great of a hand. River's a king. And now I have to ask myself again, if my opponent has a hand like ace-king, will he value bet if I check? And I think the answer is definitely yes. Next question becomes, if he has pocket jacks, is there any way for me to get money out of this hand, any additional money? And the only way to do that is to check, I think. I think if I lead into my opponent on the river, he's probably going to fold pocket jacks and pocket tens because the board has run out incredibly bad for those hands. So I think the only way to get money into this pot from the marginal hands is to check, although I don't really think he's betting pocket jacks or tens very often. And if he does have ace king and I lead into him, he's going to call every time, right? So I guess I should preface this with, the only hand I'm really trying to get value from in this spot is ace king. That is a hand that I think will bet the river if I check, but if I bet, it will only call. So either way, the same amount of money goes in the pot in both of those scenarios. However, if I check and I can elect to check raise, I think my opponent will call with ace king sometimes. So I do think that check raising has a slightly higher expectation here. And if I do check raise this and my opponent decides to go all in, I'm just going to fold. And that's because I do not think my opponent's going to be check raising all in with a hand like ace king. I think when he check raises all in, it will be with an incredibly strong hand that beats me. So this is a pretty cool spot where I'm not really trying to get much value from, I'm not trying to get value from a very wide range. So I'm really specifically targeting a very narrow range in my play. And that's because I really do think by this point, my opponent's range is very narrow. Quite often, if you are playing a style where you are checking a lot to your opponents and letting your opponents tell you where they are in the hand, as I think most good players do, they try to get information from their opponents as cheaply as possible, you're going to find that sometimes you don't have very clean information. But this is an example of a spot where I think my opponent's range on the turn is exactly those hands, maybe pocket aces that he slow played, but it's going to be a hand that has me winning pretty much every time, I think, by the river. So anyway, I check river. My opponent bets 1,500. So now we have to ask ourselves, if he does have ace king, how much will he call? Or if he has pocket aces, how much will he call? And I think he'll call a relatively large raise. I don't think you want to be raising small. I think you want to put in a raise that puts your opponent in a scenario where he thinks you could be bluffing with a busted draw. Notice that if I had a busted draw, say I had ace 5 of clubs, am I really check min raising or check raising to 3,300? And the answer is no. So I want to check raise this spot fairly large. Also, you can read into my opponent's bet size a little bit here. This is something you cannot do against great players because they just bet the same size with everything. But a lot of amateur players will bet specific sizes with specific portions of their range. And a lot of guys, if they're going for full value of something like top 2 pair or a set of kings, they're going to bet more like 4,500. Whenever this guy bets 1,500, it makes me think he's trying to get called by a weak hand. And if he's trying to get called by a weak hand, that sort of implies he either thinks I have air, which could be true, or that he has a hand that he thinks that if he bets too big, I'll start folding out a lot of the weak hands, so he's only getting called when he's beat. So I think I have the best hand here a ton of the time. If my opponent did bet 5,000 or 4,500 on the river, I would have just check called. But when he bets 1,500, I think we do need to go for the check raise. And notice I raised to 5,500, so 4,000 on top, a pretty sizable raise. And I actually remember this hand. My opponent pretty much instantly called. And again, whenever he instantly called, I was pretty unhappy. I assumed he must have had random king, queen, or something like that. But I showed my hand, and he mucked. So I feel like this would be a little bit too thin of a value bet sometimes on the river versus some players. But in this exact scenario, based on what I knew about my opponent, I think this is a very standard check raise. And I'm not doing a whole lot of thin check raising on the river versus satellite qualifiers, but there are certainly spots for it. And I think this is a very ideal one. So thank you all very much for watching this video. If you have any questions or comments, let me know. And let the people at Poker News know what you think. Thank you very much, and I will talk to you next time.